All right, it's good to see everybody this evening. We have a real treat with us this evening. We're going to be discussing walnut syrup production, and we have Kate Fotos with Future Generations University in West Virginia. And we actually had Kate as part of our Kentucky Maple Syrup School last year. She did a phenomenal job on maple syrup production. There is a lot of there's a lot of people that's doing the maple, but not too many doing walnut. And so we wanted to cover walnut with you all in this Mountain Zoom, because we do have a few that are doing some walnut production. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Kate. Thank you for being with us this evening and discussing walnut syrup production.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's great to be here. As Jeremy said, my name is Kate Fotos, and I'm the field coordinator for Future Generations University Appalachian Program. And for those of you who don't know where we are state to your east in West Virginia. My family is actually from the Kentucky, West Virginia line down in the Huntington area, if anybody is from that area of the world. So tonight we're talking about more than maple. We're talking walnut syrup production. And I might stop my video. I have a little bit of bandwidth issues, so just to make sure the sound's coming in. Great. So here's sort of an overview of my talk. We're talking about walnut syrup. So the question is, what is walnut syrup, right? Maple syrup, as many of you know, is the syrup that is produced from boiling down pure maple sap. It is 100% sap that's been heated up and concentrated. And walnut syrup is the exact same. It is walnut sap that we've collected from the trees during early spring and boiled down to make a sweet, nutty syrup. Now, the reason I clarify this is because some of you might be familiar with hickory syrup, and hickory syrup is not actually sap. It is sort of like something that's snuck in with the tree syrups, but slightly different. People toast the bark of a hickory tree and then soak that toasted bark in a cane sugar based syrup. So let's talk the talk outline. We're going to cover what we know about walnut, where we are going with walnut, and why is it important, right? Why am I here talking to you all about walnut? Why should you care? So let's talk about what we know. And if you can read that little light writing on the slide, it's a little hint. We don't know a ton. To put this in perspective, right? Maple syrup has had research done on it in earnest by universities since before the 1970s. That's a lot of years of research. Walnut research, some of the earliest walnut research we can find only dates from around 2010. So in comparison, we're dealing with a lot less information out there. There hasn't really been a big research push in walnut until recently. So we're all sort of learning as we go, which I think makes the industry a little bit more interesting, because you get to kind of play along with the researchers. So we know a little bit about the general process, right? It's actually pretty similar to maple. You collect the sap from the trees with the same equipment you use in your maple syrup, and you boil down the sap in the same styles of evaporator. Now, where we get a little bit of difference is, one, we are dealing with a lot less sap. So maple trees produce about 2 gallons of sap per day on gravity, right? So that means into your bucket, you'll get about 2 gallons on a good day. In walnuts, we're seeing about 2 gallons of production per year per tap on buckets. So that's a huge difference, right? You're dealing with a lot less sap. The other thing that we know that is a little different is pectin, right? So there's pectin in walnut sap, and it is, it creates sort of a barrier in some senses. It can clog RO membranes, it can clog filters, and it can turn your syrup into jelly pretty quick. So there's some little differences in the process, but not too much. Let's talk about sap collection first. So maples, if y'all are familiar with the wood classifications, tree classifications, are a diffuse porous tree, right? So it means it has all of these little pores throughout every year. So on this picture, I'm trying to find the annotate, but I don't know if I have it. Well, these horizontal lines across this picture are the growth rings of the tree. So this is 1 year growth, 2 year growth. The vertical lines are the rays, which are vessels that run nutrients from the outside of the tree into the heartwood and vice versa. And then each of these little dark dots is a vessel that's carrying sap from the roots of the trees all the way up to the highest leaf. Now, in maple trees, they grow these vessels pretty evenly throughout the growing season. Now, in ring pores, all the way here on the left, this is like your oaks, right? They just grow one single section of large pores at the start of every growing season. So you can see very clearly with the lowest one in the picture, you have these large pores right at the start of your growing season, and then a lot of solid wood growth out. Now, why is this important? Why do we talk about diffuse porous versus ring porous with maples? Diffuse porous, this pore system, is actually what is making the maple trees go through the physiological function of creating the internal pressure during that early season, that early spring season that pushes sap out of your trees. So diffuse porous trees like maples, sycamore, birch, all have that sweet sap, whereas ring porous trees, if anybody has accidentally tapped an oak, you will know you will never get any sap out of that oak. Now there is this in-between realm of semi-ring porous. So you do have some large pores, but you also have some small pores mixed in. And this is where our walnuts fall. So this is kind of why we see some differences in sap collection, why there is such little production from a walnut compared to a maple, is they are inherently a slightly different wood structure. So as I was saying, we're getting about 1.6 gallons per season per tap. And this is a slightly old number. I think if we put in some of our numbers from this past year, it would bump up a little bit to 2. And this experiment was run on about 749 walnut taps. So that's our sample size we're dealing with. And we've noticed that some trees produce much more sap than others. If you have tapped walnuts, you might be able to attest to this. We had some trees that it felt like I was getting 2 gallons almost every day. And I had another tree almost directly next to it that produced nothing over the entire season, right? And Naughton in 2006, Dr. Naughton works with the University of Missouri, said that it might be related to sapwood depth, right? So the depth of that light wood on the outer rings of the tree itself. However, I guess to backtrack slightly, however, nobody's really done much more research into why some trees produce really well and why some trees don't. So there's a lot of speculation out there, but we don't really know. We look at sap sugar content, right? As sugar makers, the sugar itself is what we're after. So if our sap isn't very sweet, then it might not be worth our time. But we see that these sugar content of walnut is similar to our maples in West Virginia. So in West Virginia, we tend to hover around 1.8 to 2% sugar on average in maples, and that's actually what we're seeing in walnuts. We've seen some dip a little bit lower, and we've seen some exceed 2, but on average, we're sort of in that 1.5 to 2% sugar range. So that's actually pretty promising, right? We're not dealing with no sugar at all. We're dealing with sap that's fairly similar to maple in the sugar content. Now let's look at vacuum, right? many maple producers use vacuum to produce more sap. For every inch mercury of vacuum you apply to your maple tubing, you're getting about 5 to 7% more sap in maples. So naturally, our thought process was, well, we're not getting a lot of sap out of our walnut trees. We should apply a vacuum, right? So back in 2019, we did a low vacuum study. So we had an upper line, which is this blue on your screen, and we had that run at 1.7 times, sorry, back up slightly. So we had an upper line blue, lower line red. I got ahead of myself there. And the upper line would actually outproduce that lower line 1.72 times with no vacuum on either line consistently. Now, it was averaging about 0.37 quarts per hour with no vacuum. And then when we bumped up the vacuum, and when I say low vacuum, we're talking about 8 inches mercury to 10 inches mercury, which in the maple world is fairly low. We got an average of about 0.74 quarts per hour. So we can see that it pretty much doubled our sap output, which is a good sign. We then bumped up to higher vacuum, which we saw actually triple the sap flow. So we had 6.1 gallons per hour with no vacuum, and we were able to crank the vacuum on that system up to about 15 inches of mercury, and we got about 18.3 gallons per hour. Now, there are some caveats in that that was a single trial. We weren't able to replicate it. So we still have a fair amount of research to do on higher vacuum in walnut, which we were actually able to do in subsequent years. Before I get into the subsequent years trials, this is sort of what we were talking about with no vacuum versus low vacuum, right? So you can see on February 12th with no vacuum, it didn't produce anything. And with vacuum, you bumped it up to around, 0.35. And as you can see across the board on every single date, the tubing with some vacuum on it really outproduced the tubing with no vacuum rate. So we're already seeing that if you're going to tap walnuts, vacuum is going to be worth your time, right? So here we get into our, that should actually be 2020, not 2021. This was 2021, sorry. Sap season. It's crazy. It's about to be 2022. And on this first graph on the left, we have equal vacuum on lines A and lines B. And we were actually able to reuse those same lines that were mapped out on that earlier slide. So line A is the dark line and line B is that light line. And you can see with equal vacuum of about 15 inches, line A consistently outproduced line B. But then we went ahead and switched line A to no vacuum. We shut off the vacuum to it and kept elevated the vacuum on line B to 22.5 inches of vacuum. So now we're kind of getting up into what the maple industry considers high vacuum. And for some reason, on March 3rd, they actually produced the same. Now, that could be because that could be just due to some flukes. It could be due to a lot of things, but we're not really sure why on March 3rd they produced the same. And then consistently after that, the high vacuum outproduced the no vacuum. And now to us, that's not a huge surprise, right? We kind of know that vacuum is going to increase the production. What really surprised us was this last trial. So we had medium vacuum versus high vacuum. So on line A, we applied 10 inches of vacuum, while on line B, we had 17 inches of vacuum. And line A outproduced line B almost every single day except for March 11th. And that was kind of interesting, right? That's not what we were thinking. And then I had a question in the chat about what is the tube diameter and the slope. So these were all, the slope on these lines is actually pretty flat. They were in a river bottom. I don't have the exact grade, but I would say not much more than 3 to 5% on them. And then the first trial we did was with a diaphragm pump, a little SureFlow pump on 3/16 line. And then these trials with the high vacuum and medium vacuum, we actually exchanged the tubing for 5/16 to hook up a true, I think it's a screw vacuum pump from CDL. But yeah, so what does this mean, right? What does this last chart mean? And if we, I don't think I stacked this slide deck quite right, but let me backtrack for a second. If we go back to this picture, what we think is happening is when you apply high vacuum, right, that 22, 17, 22, 28 inches of vacuum, instead of actually producing more sap out of the trees, you just start pulling air out of some of these bigger pores. When we were first getting into walnut back in 2018, we actually looked at the percent of air in tubing for maple versus walnut. And in a maple, like a fully loaded maple 3/16 line, we saw that there was only about like 3 or 4% air if you break down how much sap is in the line versus how much air is in the line. Whereas in walnut, we were seeing anywhere from like 70 to 90% air in the line. So we know that walnut really off gases, like you produce a lot more tree gases in your walnut tubing than you do in maple. So we think with that higher vacuum, you're just actually pulling more tree gas out of the tree instead of more sap. So that's kind of why we think that this medium level of vacuum performed better than the high vacuum, because it was pulling on that air, but it was also not pulling that air so hard that it kind of left the sap behind. But that's kind of interesting, right? So we're starting to see, this all needs replication, right? Science is about trial and replications and data sets and building robust data sets. So we need more replications of this data to really have a conclusive argument, but it's starting to look like that for your walnut system, it might not actually pay to go to a very high-end, very powerful vacuum pump. You might be able to get away with a smaller pump, which is kind of cool. So the last thing we kind of know is we know a little bit about the price. So bulk walnut syrup, right? We're talking low levels of production, because if you're only getting about 2 gallons of sap per tap, you're really only making about a cup of syrup per tap. So bulk in walnut syrup is in gallons, whereas bulk in maple syrup, you're talking barrels. But we're seeing at a bulk rate, walnut syrup going from anywhere from $150 a gallon to $200. And I've even had people offering this past season around $300 for just bulk, labelless, unbottled walnut syrup. Now at retail, if you're going to go through and put it in nice fancy bottles and get nice labels for it, we've been seeing some people getting upwards of $700 a gallon. And this calculated $700 a gallon is not a person buying a $700 gallon, but it's if you break up how much syrup is in these little bottles and sort of multiply out. And then we're seeing a lot of interest in the blends, right? So walnut syrup, pure walnut syrup, right, carries this heavy price tag. So a lot of people aren't going to buy it all the time because it's expensive. But if you blend walnut syrup with maple syrup, and a lot of people sort of use the 80% maple, 20% walnut, but then many producers have started to finagle those ratios to what they think tastes the best. You're bringing your price of your walnut syrup down because you're blending it, but you're also really elevating the price of your maple syrup. So we're seeing a pint of blended syrup selling for around $16, whereas a pint of maple syrup sells for 8, 6, depending on where you are in the world. So, right, we kind of knew a price range, but we also realized that as more people are getting into the commercial side of walnut production, we need to know a little bit about the market. So this past winter, I think I had a couple of you all fill this out, actually, if I remember some of my data points. We did a market research study, which is basically, we just wanted to look at what walnut syrup producers know and are seeing and how they are selling their syrup as of right now to get a better handle on where the industry is and where it is tending to go. So we circulated it through the Black Walnut Syrup Makers Facebook page and personal contacts. We were able to compile the data from this brief survey into 3 informational infographics, and they were made to be easily understood. So now you all get to see them, which is exciting. So we had about 42 responses to the survey from 17 states. We actually, the most were from Virginia. So thanks for that, Virginia. We had 7 from Virginia, 5 from West Virginia, 4 from Wisconsin and New York, and 3 from Ohio and Pennsylvania. And then all the other states that participated tended to be smaller numbers than that. If you look on the map at the very bottom left corner of this poster, you can actually see all of the states that we got responses from, which is pretty exciting. We had an average number of taps right around 78. Our low number of taps was 1. Our high number of taps was 1,000 plus. On the average number of years that they've been making syrup was around 2.5 to 3 years. So that's sort of showing you how young this industry is. Not many people have been at it for that many years. We did have a high number of 10, and we had a lot of first-year producers fill out this survey. And we had about 91.3% of people tapping black walnuts. And we did have a lot of people report that they were tapping both a mix of the butternut or white walnut and black walnut. On average, we had people producing 3.76 gallons, so just shy of 4 gallons. We had 21% of people say they sell syrup at an average price of around $320 a gallon. So that average price both included people who were retailing it and also bulk sales. So you can kind of see that we're sort of spanning that range from that 200 number up to that 700 and kind of finding that middle ground. And then we had an array of different types of collecting or collection systems. We had a lot of people using different types of taps, different sizes of tubing, buckets, tubing systems, and even bags. So there's a lot of people doing some interesting stuff out there. We had 5 people say they were using vacuum with levels of 20 to 24 inches. A lot of people weren't using vacuum. We had 2 people saying they were using an RO, which is interesting because we've seen membranes plug up when a RO is used on walnut sap. So if you're one of those 2 people who uses an RO, get in touch with me because I'd love to pick your brain on how you do that. We have 33 people using a gravity filtration system, while only 2 people use a filter press. And again, this is because that pectin has been known to really clog up filtering systems. We had 4 people say they were using other filtering systems, and that was often just letting it settle, meaning they just pour their syrup into a container and let it settle and then pour the clear syrup off the top. And then we had 2 people saying they don't filter at all, which is fine if you're just doing home use, right? So next steps, we're looking up to write up this research in a little bit more formal piece. We're continuing to distribute these infographics. If you want the PDF version of these infographics, let me know. I'm happy to share them around. And we are also looking at a possible second year data collection. So if you see this survey come by again, please feel free to fill it out again. I'm going to change up the questions to try to start tracking trends and growth in the industry. So keep filling it out if you see it. Let's talk about where we're going, right? So we're looking at tap design, right? If you have ever looked at a walnut tree and a maple tree, you can tell that the outside of the trees look very different. So we found with these maple taps, you can tell how close this tap is sitting to the edge of the bark. We've also seen that walnut wood is a little bit of softer than what we like to lovingly call rock maple or hard maple, that sugar maple wood. So we saw with these taps, they didn't seat all that well. This is a CDL signature 5/16 tap. They didn't seat all that well, and we had to drive them so close to the bark that it made them hard to work with in general. So we actually designed a sort of first test of a walnut specific spile. So this stainless steel tap over here, we had milled by RCBI, if anybody's familiar with them. And it had a higher taper and a longer barrel. So the higher taper was meant to wedge a little bit faster in the tree. And then the longer barrel was to give you more working space outside of that bark, right? Make it a little bit easier to handle. And we ran some tests to see if the walnut specific spile would outproduce a maple spile. And for the most part, it did. We had some interesting results. They weren't all completely conclusive, as you can see with this Alton Bowers entry. His walnut spouts actually underproduced his maple spouts, but for the other 3 sites, we saw them outproduce the maple spouts, right? So that's sort of cool. We actually just got funding to do a whole nother round of redesigning. So we'll keep working on those walnut spouts and trying to find a design that can both be easily commercially manufactured, so they'll be available to producers, but also functions significantly better than a maple spout that's already on the market. So sensitive slideshow. The next thing we're also looking at is pectin, right? So I've sort of alluded to it, but pectin, if you've ever made jelly, you're pretty familiar with it, is what actually causes jelly to gel up. It's a long chain molecule that when exposed to heat and sugar, creates a jelly matrix basically. And it kind of looks like snot, for lack of a better term. And as I was saying, it causes RO restrictions, right? It can gum up your membranes. It's not going to kill your RO, but you spend so much time backwashing your membranes and trying to revive your membranes that it's not time efficient. There's also filtering restrictions, right? That globs of pectin will block any kind of filter I've found so far. We've kind of looked at pectinase. Nobody's been all that successful. For those of you who are unfamiliar, pectinase is an enzyme that breaks down pectin, and it is commonly used in wine and cider and fruit juice making industries. But we haven't been very successful with it. And what we've been really looking at recently is a centrifuge. So can we spin the pectin out of either the sap or the syrup itself? Which is kind of cool. The goal is to create a continuous flow centrifuge that will spin the pectin out, and you could plumb that centrifuge straight into your RO and RO your sap. That's sort of the dream, but we're not quite there yet. There's still a lot to be worked out. Vacuum, right? We talked a little bit about vacuum, or actually a fair amount about vacuum earlier. But we have been seeing a couple of issues, one of which is tap sealing. We've seen a lot of vacuum leaks around taps and tap holes. And this is because the walnut wood is softer, and we actually think the walnut wood, as that tap hole dries out a little bit, we've seen it sort of expand and cause new leaks around taps that weren't leaking previously. So that's interesting, and that's something we have to work on. The other thing too is playing around more with high vacuum. As I said, our vacuum studies are all pretty much one season studies. And so we do need to do some replications on them to really start to figure out what is actually going on and have enough data to start making confident recommendations. And the season, right? So everybody's pretty well aware of the maple season. We always say you want to hit the peak freeze thaw cycle, and your maple season will last about 6 weeks if you're lucky. Now, walnut, we're seeing a 3-week season, which is interesting, and we're not quite sure why yet. We do see that we are getting pressure and runs during that stem pressure season, right? So those freeze thaw days. And then we are also getting, we've also seen some evidence of root pressure, and root pressure is what birch trees run off of, if anybody's familiar with birch syrup, and that is an osmotic pressure. So it actually happens when the soil around the roots of the tree warms up. So if you ever want to tap birch, you actually tap your birch pretty much after your maples stopped running. It's a later season in the year. And this graph you're looking at here, this figure, these dark lines are when we saw sap runs, and then you can see the low temperatures in upper track, which is where our research site was, and these high temperatures running as well. And then these lines, this line is this line is running at, the upper orange line is running at 40 degrees, and this lower yellow line's running at about 25 degrees, just to sort of give you a visual. We're also looking into scarring, right? So if anybody's familiar with Dr. Abby Vandenberg's work, maples, when you put a hole in them, create a dark scar column. And Dr. Vandenberg, in her 2016 research, showed that on average, you're getting about 75 times the area of the tap hole in scar tissue. And that works out in most maples. If you're following a 5/16 drill bit and about 2 inches deep, is about 35.2 cubic inches of scar tissue in that sapwood. And we care about that because that is what actually feeds into how big of a tree you can tap, how aggressively you can tap, and tapping pattern in general, right? If you're a maple producer, I hope you're following a tapping pattern where every year you move about 2 to 3 inches over and then 6 to 12 inches up or down from that old tap hole. That's standard in maple. In walnut and in the walnut industry, most people are following those maple standards, but we've seen that walnuts actually scar and heal differently than maple, right? They're a different tree. And in scarring in walnut, we're seeing from a small sample size that on average, you're getting about 8.6 cubic inches of scarring, which is about 4 times less than what you see in maples, which is kind of crazy, right? And then we're also seeing increased healing. If you look at this lower picture, you can see where the tap hole was. And this is 1 year of growth. 1 year of growth gave us about a full inch of healthy sapwood over that hole. And these were taken out of the Catawba forest near Blacksburg, Virginia. So what does this mean, right? Right now, we don't have enough conclusive data to really tell anybody to tap walnuts differently than you would maple. But as we continue to collect data points, if this continues to hold true, basically it means you can tap smaller walnuts. You don't have to wait for them to be 10 inches in diameter, right? Because their heal rate and their scarring rate means that those smaller trees will scar less and heal more than a smaller maple would, which is pretty cool. But again, this is very preliminary. As of right now, if you're thinking about going and tapping walnuts this season, stick with maple guidelines. But it's kind of cool. It's on the horizon. So again, this is sort of a plug for all industries, Walnut included, because you're dealing with less sap. I have had issues in the past with walnut sap souring because you get less sap every day. So there were some days where I didn't have enough sap to run my evaporator. And we see souring sap as a bacteria problem, right? The bacteria in the sap are what is causing your sap to sour. And sanitation is one way to combat this, right? And we've seen sanitation become really important in 3/16 tubing. And the way we've started to combat that is a 5/16 drop, which just keeps sap out of your tap holes. Another one is silver spouts or silver impregnated spouts. They're antimicrobial. We've seen those be helpful. We've seen people starting to wash tubing with calcium bleach. Arthur Kruger kind of patented this method up in Vermont, and it is about 400 parts per million, which is about 2 tablespoons per gallon. Yeah, 2 tablespoons per gallon of water. And you want to let that sit in your lines. And then the last one is some people are just flushing their lines with a distilled water. But basically, the point of this slide was just to say anything you can do to help improve your sanitation, from scrubbing your sack tanks to washing your lines in the walnut industry and in the maple industry, is going to help you keep sap longer, stop sap from spoiling, and make better syrup in general. So this is just a little plug. There are also other species you can tap: sycamore, birch, and some of the others are beech. Somebody tried to tap black cherry. They didn't really get much, but there's some people playing around with other species. I am working on a research project on sycamores. I know some people up at the University of Vermont and Cornell are working on some birch studies, which is pretty cool. So keep your eyes out if you're interested in cool alternative tree syrups. Now, why is this important, right? And why do we care about the walnut trees, and specifically walnut trees in terms of syrup production? So the current importance, right? It is presently a non-timber forest resource. So you have some black walnut trees on your property, you're not planning on cutting them down. This is a way to use them to make money on your property, which is helpful. And they are giving existing producers a way to diversify their operations, right? So if you already make maple syrup, you have a lot of the equipment already. So it kind of gives you an easy product to add on, to add a little bit more profit into your operation. Again, here is Kentucky. You guys are sort of right down in here, if you can see my mouse, where that arrow is. And this is the current range of sugar maples, right? Our quintessential maple syrup tree. You can see that they really don't extend much further south beyond where we are currently. Now let's look at black walnut, right? On this left, we can see we're pretty smack dab in the middle of the black walnut territory. Black birch, it's coming towards you, and sycamore, again, smack dab in the center of that, right? So as we see species sort of migrating north, this also happens to plants. They're migrating towards more favorable climates for themselves. We might actually see sugar maples start to leave Kentucky and Appalachia in the long run. So getting into the black walnut industry, you're giving yourself a little bit of resilience if for some reason there were to be a maple die-off in your area, right? You are probably going to remain black walnut habitat for quite some time. Great. So let's talk about the economic benefits, right? Because even though we are syrup producers, and I heard someone this past weekend who was talking to a bunch of syrup producers say syrup producers have decided to die broke. We do want to make some money, right? We are in the industry both for the interest in trees, the fun, but it's nice when you can also turn a profit. So we see in black walnuts, you can get about to 8.3 inches in diameter in 14 years, right? So the United States Department of Agriculture and Silvix of North America has calculated that out, that on average takes about 14 years for black walnut to get to 8.3 inches in diameter. To be a veneer tree, you want to have it be about 120 feet tall and 30 inches in diameter, and that will take you about 50 years, right? So if we kind of like do a little bit of funky math, we can sort of estimate that to get to about 10 inches in diameter, right, maple tapping diameter will take about 20 years. So let's look at the product prices. So if we estimate about $360 a gallon, which is what our market research told us, that's 90 bucks a quart, that's 45 bucks a pint, which means that's $22.50 a cup for every 8 ounces. Now, this little sapling will take 50 years to get to this nice big tree, whereas this tapped tree will take about 30 years to get to this nice big tree, right? So that gives us 30 years to kind of play with the tree before it is a sort of desirable logging size. So if we estimate that on average a tap will produce about, under vacuum, produce about 4 gallons of sap, that gives us about 2.5 cups of syrup. So you're looking at 30 years times 6930, which is about 2 cups of syrup worth of product. You'll make $2,079 per tree in 30 years. Kind of as a rough estimate, just to sort of show you what is possible. And this is sort of wrapping up my talk. I hope that was sort of eye-opening. It is a really interesting niche to be in. I highly suggest it. I find it really interesting and fun. Again, as I was saying, the cool thing is we don't know that much about it. So producers, I work with a lot of the walnut producers, and they are working right beside me, figuring this all out, right? We are still learning every single year. And just for a quick plug, Future Generations University does have some other resources if anybody's interested. And then at the bottom of the slide is my email address. I'm happy to answer any questions if you want to ask them offline or on this call right now. But thank you all for listening. I'll turn my video back on.
Hey, thanks so much. If you have any questions, just go ahead and type them in the chat pod. Great stuff there. I know there was something earlier. Shab was asking about the tube diameter and slope, and I think you answered that, didn't you?
Yeah, I've set up a lot of different walnut systems. We run some walnuts on 3/16, some walnuts on like a pretty traditional 5/16 vacuum system that's often used in the maple industry. I've seen walnuts produce well on both. I've seen walnuts not produce well on both. So we don't really have a full picture of what is best for a walnut. I think it kind of comes down to what your layout and what your system needs to look like for your property.
I've got a quick question. I know you mentioned the veneer earlier, just trying to give a, an age time frame there. When you all are tapping walnuts there in West Virginia, are you looking at maybe a not so good looking walnut compared to something that would be veneer quality in the future? And how do you judge?
Absolutely. So for veneer quality trees, you're really looking for trees that have a very straight, almost perfect trunk. So they're often grown sort of in the middle of forested stands. They're rarely edge trees because edge trees tend to have a lot of lower branches. You want to look for any damage in the trunk. You want to look for any obvious signs of old branches. So like knots, boils, all those things can really be indications of not a veneer log, and then the longer the better, right? So the longer that perfect section is, the better off you are. I would say with walnut syrup, what I always tell people is if you think you have a veneer log, don't tap it, leave it veneer. Because if you have a veneer log, sell it and pay for your system. But in general, right, we're after sugar and trees. So the more crown space, the more branches, the more leaves a tree has, the higher the sugar content's going to be. So I find with walnuts, some of the better producers are those like edge grown trees with large canopies anyways. So I'd say leave your very pretty, almost perfect walnuts to be logged if you do log your property or that's something you're interested in, and tap your scraggly ones. I know plenty of us have good old scraggly stands of walnuts on the property.
Good information. So the ugly trees are good to go for tapping. That sounds great. Sounds great. Any other questions by anybody out there?
Kate, I have a question. I have a producer here in Wise County, Virginia, who has some pecan trees intermingled with his walnuts. Now, has anybody looked at pecans? Is that going to be similar? I know with the hickory you were talking about, that's not done in the traditional way that syrup is made, but I'm just wondering if pecan would fall more in line with the walnut as far as the sap flow or not.
I don't know. I've never tapped a pecan tree, and I don't know if I've run into anybody who has. Do you know, are they also semi-ring porous? Or are they more, do you know the wood structure?
I don't.
That would be my first question, because if they're ring porous, I wouldn't really spend the time. But if they're semi-ring or diffuse porous, it might be worth sticking a tap in one and seeing what happens.
Right. Okay.
There's a question in the chat. Any suggestions on dealing with the pectin? Can filtering several times while boiling the sap help and maybe improve the flavor? Yeah, so that is actually my suggestion for pectin. What I've seen is while you're boiling, you'll actually start to see, I call them jellyfish. They kind of form and float in your evaporator. And I'll scoop the jellyfish out, and then I actually hang a cone filter over my front pan. And while I'm boiling, I will like scoop some, pour it through the cone filter, and just sort of keep circulating. Actually, it's over my back pan. Sorry, I misspoke. Keep circulating that hot concentrate, that hot sweet through that filter. And it definitely it definitely helps with the final filter. I've found if I don't do that, the final filtering, like when you're ready to draw off and getting it ready to bottle, is almost impossible. It just is really gummy. The other thing I suggest is plenty of pre-filters. If you're using a cone filter or a flat filter, or any kind of gravity system, invest in the pre-filters and stack them, because I find it really helpful to be able to pull a pre-filter out with that glob of pectin in it and then just keep filtering while you're at it. And it saves you a lot of like filter cleaning in the long run.
Great information. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I don't see any coming in. Kate, thank you very much for joining us tonight from West Virginia and giving us some great information on walnut syrup. So she's given a lot of information to us. You're well armed now with the information about walnut syrup. So if you got some of those walnuts out there and you're already tapping maples, or maybe you're not tapping maples, definitely this is something to give a try.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being with us. Shad Field, do you have anything for future Mountain Zooms or?
Well, we this will be a work in progress. We're supposed to hang on and do a little planning afterwards. So stay tuned.
All right, sounds good. So we'll send you the information out via Facebook, via the 5 Point Fridays, that sort of thing. So everybody, good to see everybody this evening. Kate, once again, thank you very much. And we'll see everybody on the next Mountain Zoom. Everybody have a great evening.
Thank you. Hopefully one day I can meet y'all in Kentucky.
Definitely sounds